Yo guys, what is up? Max here in Diablo 4 video, and today we're going over my Bleedzerker Barbarian build. This is the 2.0 version of Bleed Whirlwind. The last time I made this video, it was level 75. I've learned a lot about the game, I've got better gear, and I've got a better version of the build to present to you today. Now, real quick, before we get into the video, this is going to be a two-handed Bleed Whirlwind build. I was testing with a Bludgeoning Whirlwind build, and I did 20 Nightmare Dungeons. I did splitting between bludgeoning and bleed, and I found when I started to push into the higher tiers and the higher content, bleed was superior, and that's what I'm going to be showing off today. However, I did find when I was trying to speedrun content, aka non-Nightmare Dungeons, normal content, bludgeoning was a little bit faster, so I will also have a speed version of the build that focuses on bludgeoning, but to players that are getting into Whirlwind, this is the version that I would recommend getting into the endgame. It'll provide you better bossing, really great mobbing, it's all around great survivability, and it's just a fantastic build. I hope you guys enjoy it. This is going to be a longer video. I dive into a ton of stuff. Let's get right into it. Before we get into the video, I just want to play you guys this clip. This was a Nightmare Dungeon that I was running on the Bludgeon version of the build, and I was doing fine up until I came across this really high damage, high health elite, and I was struggling to get it done on the Bludgeon version, and then I swapped to the Bleed, and I want to show you guys the difference. So this is me running around. We've got the Bludgeon setup. I walk into this room, and there is this elite. This elite is enchanted with Poison, Electrified, Obelisk, and Fire Enchanted. They've got all these nasty modifiers, and there's a ton of enemies in the room. I walk into the room, I pop my buffs, I stun him, and I try to go for my damage window. Note, I am losing so much health in here. They are dealing a ton of damage. So I've got a few seconds to try to get this guy down. I note that all the ads are hurting me. I'm trying to get him done because there's so much damage getting pumped. Note here, I retreated for a few seconds because I noted that my shouts weren't quite up. So I walked away, re-engaged with my shouts, came back in, taking a ton of damage, stomped him again, and I'm just taking so much damage. He is not dying. I've hit him for multiple millions now. I had a Gore's proc for 1 million, and eventually he just kills me. And one of the reasons I found with bludgeoning why it was worse for Nightmare Dungeons is because you have to sit in damage. You don't have any of this like prolonged damage that you get with bleed. So basically, I went and respect. I moved around my gear. I swapped to the bleed version of this build, and then I ran back and took on the elite. And I want to show you the difference. And one of the big reasons that bleed is able to do so much damage to elites is because bleed stacks. Now, bleed is not as good for killing trash mobs because bleed doesn't stack up on trash mobs. But as soon as you get an enemy that is high health, every time that you spin on Whirlwind, you're stacking up more and more bleed damage. Your bleed damage stacks, and it's so good against higher health, harder to kill elites. So this is the same elite. You can see he's got the Poison, Electrified, Fire Enchanted. He puts up the totems. He puts up the fire. Everything that I was doing before. I go in, I spin, and look at this bleed damage. That is like a fourth of his bar is gone almost instantly of just bleed. Notice I haven't done anything, and he's gone. He is just done. That is a 96k bleed tick. Now, 96,000 is the bleed damage number that we're doing, but bleed damage ticks twice a second. So it's ticking every half a second. So that is 96,000 bleed damage every half a second. AK, we're dealing over 180,000 damage as just bleed damage, and that is why I found the bleed version better overall, because when you're comparing them, both are good against killing trash enemies and doing normal content because you'll kill everything. But when it comes to pushing these Nightmare Dungeons, not only was I outputting more damage on these single targets and these higher health elites, but I was also able to avoid more damage because with bleed, you can hit enemies and get out. With the like bludgeon version, you have to stick around, you have to get the enemies down, versus with bleed, I was basically could do my damage and get away, and I was avoiding so much more damage, and I was able to push up my Nightmare Dungeon clears up into the 58s, 59s, and 60s with the bleed version of this build. And so that's why I want to break down and show to you guys today. Now let's go over my gear. I'm going to be doing stat priorities for every slot. Now, to start us off, I am using a helmet prioritizing cooldown and maximum life, and I'm using the aspect of disobedience. Now, this is probably the best defensive aspect in the game. It's going to give us 50% increased armor. Now, a really important note here is I am currently sitting at 6.5k armor, which is going to give me 57% damage reduction to physical damage and 50% of that 57 to non-physical. Now, when I stack up my armor aspect, the disobedience, I'm going to get 50% more armor, aka 57 times 1.5, which is 85% physical damage negation, which is perfect because armor reduction for physical damage caps out at 85%. So the way that I'm sitting right now with my build, I am sitting basically exactly on the line of perfect physical damage reduction, and getting this armor up to 6.5 and getting this aspect to 50% has made a massive difference in my survivability because it's giving me so much damage negation. Next up, I'm using the Paragon chest piece. This chest piece is amazing because it gives us a 38% or up to 40% chance on lucky hits to reduce the cooldown of our non-ultimate skills by 1.5 seconds whenever we're inflicting bleeding on elites, which we can proc multiple times. Now, our non-ultimate skills are going to be Rallying Cry, War Cry, Challenging Shout, and potentially Ground Stomp. We're going to talk about Ground Stomp in a second, but one of the things that I started to notice is when I was playing the bludgeoning version of this build, Ground Stomp was so great. I could immediately put elites down on the ground for 3 seconds and kill them in that duration, and then all of a sudden I was like, why don't I try Ground Stomp on a bleed build? And what I found is Ground Stomp works even better on a bleed build than it does a bludgeoning build because bleed builds can use Paragon, and Paragon will reduce the cooldown of Ground Stomp, meaning we can have this up way more often. I was having Ground Stomps on like a 5-second cooldown, and you can just put enemies down on the ground and delete them before they even have a chance to hurt you, which is making up for some of the loss of survivability that we might lose because the Rage of Paragon doesn't come with too much damage reduction. Now, if you do not have this chest piece, I recommend looking for something like this chest piece: damage reduction from close, damage reduction from bleeding, ranks to Challenging Shout, and increased damage. The priority on your chest piece, the #1 thing you're looking out for, is ranks of Challenging Shout, and then followed up by damage reduction. This is also a pretty good chest piece: damage reduction from enemies that are bleeding, ranks of Rallying Cry, ranks of Challenging Shout. Ideally, you can get 4 ranks of Challenging Shout, but your chest piece, you do not need to use the Paragon if you do not have it. The build is just fine without it. Just look for Challenging Shout and damage reduction so that you can stack up even more DR on this build. Next up, we're using the Gore's Devastating Grips. Now, Gores are really, really great. I originally wasn't too impressed with these things until I ranked them up. When you rank them up, you can get them to +4 of Whirlwind, and they give us a huge burst of damage. They deal more damage on the bludgeoning build, but they still deal a ton of damage on the bleed build, and it allows us to get in and nuke enemies during that vulnerable phase. And that vulnerable phase, and anytime we touch an enemy, we've got 3 seconds of vulnerable. We're going to want to spin, inflict our bleeds, proc our gores, and keep moving. And I'll explain more of that when we get to our Paragon board, but note that this is what is causing the explosions on our Whirlwind. I always get asked, how is your Whirlwind exploding? That is what these do. Next up, we're using the Temerity pants. Now, I did a ton of testing using these pants versus using pants that weren't unique pants that gave us a ton of damage reduction. These pants, for example, give us damage reduction to close, strength, ranks of War Cry, and damage reduction from injured enemies, and they give us a barrier whenever we go against an elite. So they're basically, on paper, better versions of these unique pants. And I kept using these, and then I was using these, and I was looking at the footage, and I was trying to figure out which one was better, and I came to the conclusion that the Temerity pants are better for this build. Now, the reason that these are so good is because they are going to constantly give us a barrier, and a barrier is an additional layer of defense. Now, one thing that you may not know is if you get hit while you have a barrier up, the barrier is taken before your life is. So no matter how much barrier you have, if you ever have barrier, it is additional life or additional survivability before enemies can get to your health bar. Fortify does not work like that. So Fortify is just another layer, but it doesn't actually subtract before your health. If you have 100 health and 100 fortify and you get hit for 200, you're going to lose 200 health and 200 fortify. Fortify only gives you benefits when you're at the fortify cap, aka you're fortified for the exact amount of life that you have, and then you get damage reduction. You don't actually get a barrier to your health, which is what barrier is. And watching the gameplay between using these like normal pants and this elite, getting this barrier, I noticed that I never really had a barrier because this barrier gets deleted really, really fast, and it can only happen once every 30 seconds. And so even though we can get a ton of damage reduction on these pants, in testing and in my footage, I found the temerity were giving me better survivability because I was constantly getting a barrier and I was constantly had that extra layer of protection. Next up, we've got our boots. Now, the priority on your boots is movement speed, number 1. Fury cost reduction, number 2. Number 3, movement speed after killing an elite. And if you can get it, berserking duration. That would be the absolute god roll perfect boots. Now, on my boots, I'm running the aspect which whirlwind pulls enemies in. I really like this aspect. It's great for running content. However, if you're really trying to push high nightmare, I wouldn't run this aspect. In testing, whirlwind pulls enemies in, sometimes pulls a bunch of elites, and then you're dead. So this aspect is really, really great for just being efficient when you're clearing content, and I wouldn't take it off. But if you are trying to push the higher content, you can put on the, like, whenever you basic attack, you get damage reduction. You can get damage reduction from bleeding enemies. You can add the thing that whenever you generate fury at maximum fury, you get fortify. There are a lot of options. You could even put on just a straight up movement speed aspect here so that whenever you gain unstoppable, you get more movement speed, and that'll make you faster. I do like the whirlwind pulls. Just note, if you're running super high-end nightmare dungeons, sometimes pulling 10 elites on top of yourself isn't the greatest idea. Next up, we get to our weapons. Before we get into the weapon stats, I just want to quickly show you guys the damage formula for the Barbarian so you can understand why I'm prioritizing certain stats on my weapons. And if you prioritize these damage stats on your gear, you're going to increase your damage dramatically. Now, this is the damage buckets, aka the damage formula for a Barbarian. The main important things that we need, anything here that has this big black dot, is going to be multiplicative, and anything in these subcategories are going to be additive. So when we're looking for our main damage, we need strength, we need percentage increases to our damage, we need crit damage, we've got the additive damages, which everything here is additive with each other, aka your damage to bleeding is additive to your damage to crowd controlled, close, damage to elites, damage to healthy, damage to slowed, stunned, while berserking, while fortified, with slashing, with swords. All of these things are additive, aka they're not nearly as good as things that are multiplicative, aka things like vulnerable damage. Now, vulnerable damage is in a category of its own, and nothing else can give you damage to this category besides vulnerable damage. So that is why we prioritize vulnerable damage with this build, because it is one of the best multipliers, strongest multipliers in the entire game. We're going to go for main stat, aka strength. We're going to go for crit damage, and then we're going to pick an additive on our weapons that is going to be up the most consistently. For example, damage versus healthy, not great because it's not up all the time. Versus damage versus close is constantly active because we're a whirlwind build, or damage to bleeding, or damage with core skills. These are the best additive things in the additive damage side of things. So when we go over and look at our weapon, here is my bludgeoning weapon. Prioritize high item power if you can get it. I've got a 791, and we've got crit damage, vulnerable damage, damage to close, and strength, as well as the whirlwind's critical strike chance is increased the longer we channel it. Next up, we've got the sword. I've got crit damage, damage to close, core skill, and vulnerable damage. With the aspect, whenever we deal damage while we're berserking, we get more bleed damage. As you saw in that little preview, we're dealing a lot of bleed damage, and even more bleed damage is fantastic. Next up on my next weapon, core damage, strength, crit damage, vulnerable. You're kind of getting the gist of it now. And the reason you want to look for swords here, don't ignore literally everything else that isn't a sword. The reason you're looking for swords is because swords get the top stat guaranteed as crit damage, and you can double stack crit damage. I'm getting more than 50% crit damage on just these two swords. Lastly, we've got my main sword, which actually is probably the worst roll out of all of them, but it did roll 817 item power, vulnerable damage, damage over time, damage to close, and strength. And one thing to note is if we go over to our stats, you can see that right now I've got 351% crit damage. I've got 335% vulnerable damage. I've got 224% damage to close enemies. And then we come over here and I've got 236% damage with core skills. If you want to come over to your stats, you're looking for the highest bonuses to vulnerable, and with your crit damage, that is where you're going to really start to pump damage with this build. Just going to take a quick second to pause. I know I'm throwing a lot of information out at y'all. If you guys have any questions about this kind of stuff, I'm always live on twitch.tv/Moxsy. If you want to come and ask me any questions, that's probably the best way to get a response from me. Also, I haven't done a sponsored video on the YouTube channel in over a year. I keep these videos sponsored free. So if you are enjoying the content, if you could take just the millisecond to hit the subscribe button so that you can get notified of when I put out more content, it really does help me out a lot. Let's get back into the video. Now for rings, it's the same story. However, on rings, we can roll crit chance. Crit chance is really, really important on rings because you can't get it many other places. So crit chance, vulnerable damage, and crit damage are the things that you're looking for. The other thing that you can get on your rings that is really great is resource generation and max health. The more max health you have, the harder it is to kill you. So on this ring, I've got resource generation. This ring, I got damage to slowed, but I'd love another roll of health. Now we get to my amulet. Now, my amulet is in a bit of a weird slot because I actually have a sacred amulet that is a better roll than the amulet that I have that is my ancient amulet. And I just want to show you guys this amulet because it's kind of perfect. So this amulet has cooldown reduction, fury cost, +2 ranks of all defensive skills, and +2 ranks into the counter offensive node. Counter offensive is when we're fortified, I deal 20% increased damage. This is a fantastic amulet. The one downside to it is sacred. So if you look at this thing, I've got 20% fury cost reduction versus a measly 11 on this thing. But I've been swapping back and forth between using these two amulets. Now, the aspect that you should use on your amulet is the Edge Masters aspect. It was taken away from us for like 5 days. I still think it is the best. Skills deal increased damage based on your available primary resource. It is really, really good. Now, I am going to be talking about a little bit more of a Nightmare Dungeon-focused version where I use the Ground Stomp plus the damage multiplier to stun enemies to just delete elites as fast as I humanly can. But for most common, like 99% of the time, you're going to want to be using your skills deal increased damage based on your primary resource because that is going to be up more often. Next up for expertise, we are using the two-handed axe expertise. What this means is that you benefit from this while not using an axe, aka we are going to deal increased damage to vulnerable enemies. This is fantastic. It's not more crit, it's not more bleed. It is just we deal everything more damage to vulnerable enemies, which we're going to be making everything vulnerable. And then for our like expertise or the weapon that we're going to be using, we are using a slashing whirlwind. You do not need to click anything here. By using a slashing whirlwind, you will just benefit from the two-handed sword expertise, which is going to give us 20% of our damage as bleed damage and 30% increased bleed damage after we kill an enemy. Now, real quick, to set your whirlwind to something, you're going to want to hit on keyboard. I don't know what it is on controller. You're going to hit the S button. This is going to pull up your selection, and then you can cycle what weapon you want whirlwind to focus on. We're going to be using slicing, aka the bleed version of the build, and that is how you do that. Now we're going to do the skill tree for the build, and we're going to go over the lunging strike version of the build first. Now note, if you are playing this build from level 50 to maybe 80, 85, you're going to want to use the lunging strike version of this build because fury generation can be tough. Once you get later, once you're in the 80s, 85s, 90s, you're able to swap away from using a resource generator, aka lunging strike. So later on, we're going to be using Ground Stomp as our last skill here instead of lunging, but lunging is just really nice, and you don't have to worry about fury as much. So we're going to go over that version first, and then I'll show you what I tweaked to use Ground Stomp. So let's open up our skill tree. Once again, we've got 2 points into Lunging Strike. This is a fantastic movement skill. We're not going all the way over here because we just don't really care about this stuff. Just 2 points to get down. We need 2 points to get down. Then we get Whirlwind. I've got 9 out of 5 Whirlwind. I'd love to get more in here. I don't actually know how I would get more without finding the Harlequin helmet, but we're picking Furious Whirlwind. 40% of the damage that we're dealing is inflicted as bleed damage. Next up, we've got Pressure Point. This is going to give us another way to make enemies vulnerable besides our exploit glyph and our Paragon Board, which we'll talk about in a second. Then we come over to our shouts. We've got Challenging Shout, which is you're going to want to get as many points as you possibly can into this, especially for harder content. It's going to give us a ton of damage reduction. This was actually nerfed in I think, half. They kind of took away a lot of our damage reduction, but here we're going to go for we get more Fury when we take damage, and then with Rallying Cry, we're going to generate Fury and get Fury, or we generate more Fury and get Fury when we use it. Next up, we come to our War Cry. This is going to give us Berserking, which is going to give us movement speed damage, and we'll talk more about Berserking later, and we're going to get more damage when we use it closer to enemies. Next up, we've got Raid Leader. A lot of people were confused about this. This gives you health. It 1000% heals you. It says heals your allies. It heals you. It's going to give us 9% of our max health per second, and that is constant because our shouts are always on us. Our shouts are lasting longer. And I had one extra point here that you could kind of put anywhere. I just threw it in Guttural Yell for enemies deal less damage when we use our shouts, which are going to be all the time. Next up, we've got some damage reduction while berserking. We generate more Fury while berserking. Later on, we're not actually going to need these points once you get your Fury under control, but for most of the time, this is really, really great stuff. Next up, we've got Pit Fighter. We deal increased damage to close enemies and get distant damage reduction. And then No Mercy, we're going to get more crit strike chance against immobilized, stunned, or slowed enemies. And we're grabbing Hamstring to make our bleed effects slow enemies. This is a really nice synergy because we're going to get 9% more crit chance against any enemy we touch with our Whirlwind. Then we come over to Thick Skin. This is going to give us counter offensive. Or with my current amulet, 20% increased damage whenever I have Fortify for more than 50% of my maximum life. Then we grab Heavy Handed, increased critical strike damage when we're using two-handed weapons, which is our big sword. We've got increasing our maximum Fury, invigorating Fury, heal for 9% of our maximum life. So we're healing like 18% of our max life per second all the time because we're spamming Fury. And the more Fury we spend, the more we heal, which works really well with Unbridled, which is going to make our skills cost more Fury and deal more damage. And then lastly, we've got Wrath of the Berserker, one of the Barbarian's best skills in the entire game. This is going to give us Berserking. It's going to give us Unstoppable. It's going to increase our movement speed and our Fury generation. But most importantly, it's going to give us Supreme Wrath of the Berserker. While Wrath of the Berserker is active, every 50 Fury you spend increases Berserk's damage bonus by 25%. While this is active, the more we spin with Whirlwind, the more damage we're going to output. And by the end of Wrath of the Berserker, you're dealing your most possible damage. You're going to want to save this to pop against elites or anything that might pose a problem to you because this is going to be when you're outputting your most damage when this is up. For the ground stomp version of the build, we're just going to make a small tweak and we're going to take a point out of Guttural and 2 points out of Pit Fighter. This is giving us close damage and distant damage reduction, but most of the time we're up close to enemies and we already have a ton of close damage and we don't really need Guttural. This is going to give us 3 points, which is then going to allow us to put our points into Ground Stomp. Now, Ground Stomp is fantastic because it's going to give us 3 seconds where an elite cannot attack us, which is really good. And it reduces the cooldown of your ultimate skill by 1 second for each enemy damaged by Ground Stomp. Note, our ultimate, Wrath of the Berserker, is when we're going to deal the most damage. So even though we're grabbing another defensive skill and we're technically running 4 defensive skills, this will actually lead to more damage because, one, elites will not be able to fight back against us. With the Heragoth chest piece, the cooldown of this is going to be cutting in half. It's really, really like spammable, and we're going to be able to constantly use it to get our ultimate back. Now, your goal, if you're playing this build, is get to the Fury generation, your Fury generation to the point where you can swap away from a generator. And one of the best ways to do that is getting your shout cooldowns low and using this ring where your shout skills generate Fury per second while active. This is a must-have for this build. In order to get this build off the ground, you absolutely need this ring. Bold Chieftain's really good. It's the best in slot. You can get the build off the ground using an Umbral aspect instead of the Bold Chieftain here. But these 2 rings plus the Whirlwind crit is what really launches this build when you're like around level 50. And if you can get these 3 things, this is where the build really starts to take off. Now for a Paragon board. Now, one thing to note is I am level 91. I haven't done all of my renown yet, and I've still got levels to go, aka I'm missing like 44 Paragon points, so I will have a full version of my Paragon board in the Discord. I'm actually flying to a wedding when this video is going to go up, so give me a second to like get that full board up in the Discord, but I want to walk you through my decision making and why I'm using what glyphs and why I went to what boards. So to start us off for our glyphs, in the first slot, I am using the exploit glyph. Now, this is the best glyph in the game for the Barbarian, and I actually made the mistake of misreading it when I first saw it. It reads, when an enemy is damaged by you, they become vulnerable for 3 seconds. This cannot happen more than once every 20 seconds per enemy. Now, the key here is per enemy. I originally thought this was you can only make one enemy vulnerable every 20 seconds, but each enemy has their own individual cooldown, meaning anytime you damage an enemy, your first time damaging them, as soon as you touch an enemy, they are vulnerable, they're guaranteed vulnerable, and having guaranteed vulnerable on every single enemy that we touch pumps the damage for this build so high because we can actually start to really take advantage of that vulnerable damage stat. So this is a must-have. Now, originally, I was using the Wrath glyph in the very first slot, and we were using that to get the critical strikes grant fury. This is still really great as a first starting node to get the build off of the ground, to start generating that fury, to make the build feel better. But as soon as you've got your fury under wraps, I strongly recommend putting the exploit glyph first, and then we're going to be using the Wrath glyph later on in the board. Next up, we come into the Decimator board. The Weapons Master board. Weapons Master board is really great as we're going to be putting the Martial glyph. Martial glyph is going to give us shout cooldowns every time we use a shout, and we're also here for a bunch of damage to elites and movement speed after killing an elite. Note, I've grabbed some armor, some strength, and some physical damage. Next up, we come into the Decimator board. Now, the Decimator board, we're not grabbing this vulnerable node because we don't need it, because we're making everything guaranteed with the Exploit glyph. Here, we're going to be placing the Disembowel glyph. Disembowel is going to give us, mainly we're here for the killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to reduce the cooldowns of your non-ultimate active cooldowns by 1 second. This is going to give us cooldowns for all of our shout skills, as well as ground stomp. So we can use ground stomp even more often with this, and it's also giving us, currently, the way that I have it leveled, almost 50% more bleed damage or physical damage over time, which is really, really nice. We've also got damage reduction from vulnerable enemies and some really nice vulnerable damage here, and more vulnerable damage up here, as well as stacking armor and even more vulnerable damage over there. Next up, we come up to the Warbringer board. Note that I did slightly spec out of some of this extra fury that I had for the Hoda build because we don't need it as much for the Whirlwind build, but we're coming up here to grab the damage while fortified, more fortified generation, but mainly for the Warbringer node. For every 75 fury you spend, gain 12% of your maximum life, 956 as fortify. We are spending like 45 fury every time we spin with Whirlwind, so we're constantly getting this fortify, which is currently my only source of fortify, and I'm still fortifying all the time. This is fantastic. Note that I'm not like max level yet, so I've had to do a little bit of min-maxing on my board. Once I get some spare points to use, I'll be coming back down and grabbing some of these blue nodes here, but mainly here for the Warbringer node, and then we've got the Territorial node up next. Now, Territorial is really great because when we get the additional bonus, it's going to give us this flat damage reduction against close enemies. That's super great, and it's also going to be stacking up damage to close enemies. We've also got more strength here, but 58.7 more damage to close enemies is great, and we can also, when I get more points, upgrade this and put even more dexterity to get even more damage to close. Next up, we're going up to the Blood Rage board. Now, this is the brand new board. I could have technically gone this way, but I went over this way to get this glyph, so I was kind of already up in this top area because I would have had to go all the way back down and around, and I didn't end up speccing here. So that is why I went up and this way to this board. You could have gone like out the right or out to the left. I found this to be the most efficient in terms of spaces. And then here we're grabbing Blood Rage. Now, Blood Rage reads, killing a bleeding enemy has a 10% chance to grant Berserking. Berserking is fantastic quality of life for the Barb. It's going to give us 25% increased damage increased movement speed. We've got a bunch of things that are like we generate more fury while we're berserking. We've got more damage reduction while we're berserking. So this is really great. And this node is great for all Barbarian builds. That's one of the reasons this was important for me. Berserking is really important for the Hoda build. It's really important for the bludgeoning setup of Whirlwind. And this gives us so much quality of life. In here, also, once I get a little bit more points, I'm going to grab the damage while berserking, plus all of the berserking duration nodes here, which is going to be great. And then we've also got the Wrath Glyph. Now, we did circle around back and put the Wrath Glyph. These are going to be the 5 glyphs that we rock in the board. I don't have enough points yet to fully spec out Wrath, so I don't have the crit fury yet. I just wanted to show you guys, but I will be grabbing all of the dexterity here so that we're going to be dealing more crit damage with our core skills, and we're going to be generating more fury whenever we critically strike. This will be even better once we get it filled out, because we'll absolutely never rely on using a basic skill again. We'll be able to fully transition to ground stomp, and like anytime we crit, we're going to be getting a bunch of fury. We've also got nodes here that are really nice for damage reduction against bleeding enemies, as well as damage to bleeding enemies and more bleeding damage, which is just going to feed more into our bleed build. We've got even more damage to bleeding enemies up here and more damage to elites. So this is going to be our final board, and I'm going to use those last like 44 points to basically fill out this board here and get up some nice like quality of life for things that I missed. Basically like putting some more points next to our exploit glyph so we can upgrade that more, grabbing some more of these like blue nodes here around here, and so on and so forth. But yeah, that is our Paragon board. Guys, that is going to do it for the video. This was a long one, but the first version of this build got so much support and so much attention, and so I hoped to follow it up with an equally as in-depth and as precise guide for you guys. I hope you enjoyed the video. Let me know if you've got any thoughts or opinions on the build. I will catch y'all in the next one, guys. Take care. Peace.